All right, sorry about all the technical difficulties, but in the era of COVID, I think everybody's pretty understanding with that. So, good evening. My name is Sashay Schettler. I'm the Indigenous Education Director for Bismarck Public Schools, and I always like to start with that video. And just a little disclaimer, normally when I use that, it's like bumping, and like the bass is going, and you can feel it, and you're just like, yes, it feels so good. But I love to use that video as an example just because of the narratives that have been projected of Indigenous peoples throughout history and really into contemporary times. It's always placed in the past, but we know that culture isn't static, people aren't static. And so this is a really good example of contemporary music, something that incorporates traditional songs and values, but also has a more modern context. So that song is actually called Indomitable, and it really just speaks, the message comes through in the video as well. When you get to hear the song and the message through the video, it's super powerful. So I would totally recommend exploring that on your own time. And some of these more contemporary bands that we have today. So as we begin this journey tonight, it's definitely going to be a conversation, and this is always a safe space. All questions are welcomed, and I know you guys have all probably had some trainings on Indigenous peoples, but I'm here to really give a Bismarck Public Schools perspective and kind of the work that we're doing and resources that we have within our community. So as we start together, I just want you to take a couple of moments and set your intention for your learning. Maybe at your table, you can share out and just kind of brainstorm, like, what brought you here tonight? What are you hoping to get from this presentation, or what are you hoping to learn? Just a couple of moments, try to talk with your table mates, and then maybe have a couple of volunteers share out. People in the chat, online, you can drop it in the chat as well. Just to restate or reiterate quick the question, just to set your intention, like, what brought you here tonight? What are you hoping to learn from this presentation? Is there anything in particular you're interested in? Just really grounding ourselves before we begin the work. Do we have anybody who's willing to share out? Go ahead.
I'm here because I have kids in the Bismarck Public Schools, so I'm just curious to know what they're about.
For sure. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, definitely excited. Go ahead.
We currently have 4 kiddos in our home that are Native, and so just they're not obviously, and so just trying to connect with them and understand a little bit more about their heritage and stuff.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. So my background, I was born and raised in Bismarck, graduated from PHS in 2012, went to Wachter, went to Prairie Rose and Groomswood Elementary. But it wasn't until I went to college that I took my first introduction to Indigenous studies, and my mind was like completely blown. Never having had the opportunity to learn about an accurate history of what happened to Indigenous peoples throughout the US and throughout North America, it really opened my eyes, and it really stirred up some feelings of anger, I would say, and that I felt that the school system had done me like an injustice because I wasn't able to learn about that. And because of the historical traumas that have happened to Indigenous peoples, I wasn't able to really fully understand my experience or really begin to heal. And it wasn't until that opportunity of education that I really began that opportunity of sharing with other people, but that healing journey within myself as well. And so now I have the opportunity to share with Bismarck Public Schools and our larger community about an accurate historical depiction of Indigenous peoples, and then really bring in culturally relevant practices into our school system. So I would like to start tonight by doing a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that we're on the homelands of Indigenous peoples, including the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, Nueita, Hidatsa, Shanish, and the Achetesh peoples. Bismarck Mandan being home to the Nueita peoples. We recognize these Indigenous peoples as having distinctive cultural and tribal legacies with contemporary culture in and of North Dakota. And now I have a video to play, but I'm not going to do that because of our technical difficulties tonight. But one thing that we like to talk about is reflecting. Have you ever had the opportunity to reflect on the homelands of the traditional people in North Dakota? Or how could you see this being implemented into your school, your home, or your community? Again, we're going to take a couple minutes, just turn and talk at your table. Online, if you have the opportunity, just drop it in the chat. We'll leave the questions up here. It'll take about 2 minutes. Just turn and talk with your neighbors. We are. Have you guys ever heard of land acknowledgement before?
No, that's new.
Yes.
That was new.
Yeah, because I
know a teacher that
that's-
has that store posted.
Yeah.
And I love that. I mean, every time I walk into his classroom.
What teacher is that?
Newt.
Newt was my teacher. He's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
He's a lot of fun.
It actually does a land acknowledgement goes up by the door in the classroom. So what does that mean? Land acknowledgement.
Okay, awesome.
I don't think I reflected.
My Simpson calls that's hilarious.
Tomorrow.
I ate lunch with him like every day when he was here, so I'll know I'm teasing him.
Actually,
Today,
I think just like, yeah, like I don't think I've spent any time thinking about what, I know,
you know, it's always so nice to have the opportunity to
traditional
traditional
lands,
Yeah.
or even, I know about some of the stuff, right, like the dam and the native homelands, but then I do reflect on the impact that really had culturally around the people. I don't understand it well. That's what I would say, I guess. So, and I like to. So I don't. It's a good question. We're gonna have to. Right.
You cook?
Me too.
Go to my office, you know?
Right, and they're just like, oh, our wishes for Did you want to change spaghetti?
And they do have a junior, my own at Century, and then Boston senior. His mom's
Same as that.
right now. Only has about 3 credits for his high school.
Yeah, hi.
And I have a private one. Oh, okay. The red one? Oh, a girl or a boy? Oh, well. Okay. Is that everybody? Okay. Okay.
Do we have anybody who would like to share out? Any reflections?
Good one.
Go ahead.
We were just talking, and I guess we didn't realize how many different tribal nations were on. A lot of them are saying that, like, a tribal nation or a tribe or on there, like, in growing up in North Dakota, it's the Mandan, Sioux. So you just kind of that that's who it was, but the names that we did not, like, we had no idea that there were so many, I'm gonna say, yeah, and the last one, like,
Shanish. So,
I don't know,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that.
thank you.
Yeah, that's a great reflection. We were talking about that over there as well. I would just like to point out that these are the traditional names. So we have Nueta, which would be Mandan, which is like the primary tribe of this area, in addition to Hidatsa. And then this is Arikara. So those three are the traditional names, in addition to like Anishinaabe and Ojibwe would be Chippewa. But these are the more like accurate names. Like even when you think about the word Chippewa, it was actually like a modified version of like a French and another, I want to say like it might have been a Mandan word, that's how you got Chippewa. And so these are their traditional names. And so even if you think about the Sioux people, or the Ochete-Shikoin, which would be the 7 council fires, and their collective unit, Sioux meant enemy, like snake in the grass. And so it's another like modified word. It is another word that I normally use, but kids don't say that. So then going back to these words, like really empowers the sovereignty of those tribes. And so, knowing this area, we have the Nueta, the Hidatsa, the earth lodges, but then we have the Ochete-Shikoin or the Lakota peoples that were more migrant and would travel around.
But do you know why they changed the name? Why did they change it to Mandan or Arikara? Why did they change it?
So that was external forces, non-natives projecting that name onto them.
It was the what we were trying to
Yep. And so then we have, we have 574 federally recognized tribes. And so when that tribal nation, the 574 federally recognized tribes, that means that they have special sovereignty. So they are considered a sovereign nation. So I have dual citizenship with the MHA nation and the United States of America. And so when they entered into treaty relations, which is the supreme law of land, they took on some of those names, like the Mandan, the Hidatsa, or Gra, because that was what was written in those treaty documents. So I like to go back to my why within education. This is a quote from Simon Sinek, and he states that trust is born out of a common sense of values and beliefs. It is absolutely essential for our survival, because when we are surrounded by people we trust and who trust us, we are more willing to take risks, we are more willing to explore, we are more willing to experiment, which requires failure, and in my opinion is the entirety of education. all with the confidence that if we turn our back, go away, or fall down, someone from within our community will watch our back, watch our stuff, and help us when we fall down. Absent trust, we still have the will to survive, but absent trust, it's every man for himself, and it becomes selfish and destructive, and we act more and more short term. And so I use this quote when we're talking about culturally relevant practices, because that's what we're trying to get at. When we learn more, when we cultivate deep empathy, we learn more about our neighbors, we're able to cultivate that, and that's what it gets to. It gets to the heart of that, which is community. And when we come together, we can build so many more, so much more beautiful things for our future. So there's a saying that we have, honoring the 7 generations of past and then building with the intentionality of the 7 generations to come. And so I think that this quote does a really good job on getting to that. So within Bismarck Public Schools, we have our 4 top values that we have: inclusion, excellence, innovation, and leadership. A lot of the work that we've been doing within Bismarck Public Schools has been represented at the state level and then also represented at the national level. And I'll get to that in a little bit. Within our demographics, we have over 1,600 Indigenous students representing over 50 federally recognized tribes. The 5 main ones being the MHA Nation, the Ochitichikoin represented by Standing Rock, which would be Lakota, Oglala, and then we have Spirit Lake Nation, which has primarily Dakota peoples, and then up north we have Turtle Mountain, which would be the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, and the Métis, and then towards the southern area we also share a small chunk of a reservation as well. So the funding that Bismarck Public Schools Indigenous Education Department has, our first federal grant that we have is the Johnson O'Malley. And so in order to be qualified, students must be a quarter blood quantum. And when we talk about blood quantum, I have inherent issues with blood quantum because it was a construction of the federal government in order to breed out Indigenous peoples. And for some reason, we're still using it as a requirement for tribal enrollment today. So our Johnson O'Malley, we get about 60 grand a year, and that's to cover student fees. And within that, we have different allowables. But primarily, we cover any type of academic fee for students. So if there's like an art fee or a gym t-shirt, our program will cover that. If there are different like classroom or library books that your student needs, basic supplies like glue, crayons, or pencils, we utilize JOM to do like different incentives for academic and cultural opportunities for students. I also have some pictures in my couple of slides.
Question, like, how do students tap into that? Does it magically happen because they're at school, their teachers, recognize what they might need, or?
It does not magically happen.
Okay.
That's a great question. And so I'm going to skip ahead a couple of slides so you have a visual. So we have 3 cultural responsive coordinators within Bismarck Public Schools. In each one of our cultural responsive coordinators, this is Donovan Lambert. He's the cultural responsive coordinator for the South Feeder. This is Jason Davis, and Donovan is a Dakota. He's from Spirit Lake. And this is Jason Davis. He's from Turtle Mountain, so he'd be Anishinaabe, Ojibwe. And he is the Northeast Feeder, so Legacy, Simley, and then the corresponding elementary schools. And then this is Chadwick Kramer. He's from Standing Rock, so he's Lakota, and he represents the Northwest Feeder. And so, yeah, these are a lot of schools that our cultural responsive coordinators have to or get to cover. So they work really closely with their school counselors, social workers, and secretaries in order to get these fees submitted. And then when those fees are submitted, we try to just automatically cover Indigenous students who qualify for JOM or Title VI immediately. If we see that they have a student fee, we just try to blanket cover all of them. But if there are additional things that your students would need support with, we can pay for glasses. But there are other opportunities and venues for funding that. So normally we try to work with a social worker to pay for those things first, and then we tap into JOM. Because when you really go and dig into the different resources that we have as a community is pretty robust, you know, to get some of those pieces covered. And then just to go back and highlight Title VI, which is approximately $300,000, and that pays for the majority of the staff. So as I was kind of covering, we have at our core are 3 cultural responsive coordinators that work directly with students. They host circle groups and do other, they connect our students with other cultural activities and connections. We have a partnership with the Monarch Project through United Tribes Technical College. And through that grant and program, we have 3 staff that are designated at each of the high schools. So we have Susie Gullis is at Legacy High School, Summer Taken Alive is at VHS, and Michaela Hellenwolf is at Century. And so our Monarch Project staff work directly with students who enroll in the program. You do have to enroll in the program, but it's a $5 million grant in our 3rd year, and they pay for different student fees as well. But they also are like a cultural connection for students to connect with at those high schools. And then lastly, we have Rob McLean, who supports just like student engagement, family engagement. And so he travels around to Legacy, VHS, Century, and also our 4th high school, our alternative school, which name I'm blanking on. South Central, thank you. Josie gave me a hard time for that. So we also have a prep facilitator, a preventative restorative educational practices facilitator. And so while our cultural responsive coordinators work with circle groups at the high school and middle school, the resource guide that we use is only approved for secondary. And so Tommy Simorowski is working on some of those preventative restorative practices at the elementary level, which just really dig into supporting students, connecting them to different cultural opportunities. She's created a curriculum called Culture Connect. She goes into classrooms and not only works with students, but helps to build the cultural competencies of our teachers. And we are also working on hiring a full-time curriculum specialist. So this is just a picture of some of our students doing drum group. Our cultural responsive coordinators, you know, assist them with accessing cultural activities, and also our Monarch Project staff as well. These are just some recommended readings that I recommend to our educators and then to anybody who would like to learn more specifically about Indigenous peoples, but then also their experience within education. So culturally responsive teaching in the brain is about culturally responsive practices and how we can utilize that within our schools. Everything you want to know about Indians, but we're afraid to ask, is by Dr. Anton Troyer, and it literally just like, it's so accessible, you just chunk and chew. There's questions, and you can go to that page and read the answer to that question. I actually gifted one of these books to each of the principals, and the majority of them have flown through it already. Education for Extinction just kind of talks about Indigenous people's experiences with boarding schools and their intentionality of
You are not to touch my phone.
their intentionality that was partnered with the genocide that happened to Indigenous peoples. And whenever I use that word, people kind of like get shocked. But if we look at the United Nations definition of genocide, each one of those components, we can pull out specific pieces of evidences that happened. And then also avid culturally relevant teaching. It's really, really good resource for educators and for families. So on here, I also wanted to link on the North Dakota Native American Essential Understandings. Fist of 5, how many of you have heard of it? 5, I've heard of it, I utilize it. 0, I've never heard of this resource before, I didn't know it was a thing. Awesome, that's good for me to know. And so I'll give you some background. In 2015, the Department of Public Instructions Indigenous Director, Multicultural Director, Lucy Fredericks. She contracted with an organization called TIE, Technology, Innovation, and Education, and they brought together elders from all of our tribal nations that share North Dakota's borders. And what they did was they asked them, what do you want your tribal citizens to know, and what do you want non-natives to know as well? And so they came up with these 7 North Dakota Native American essential understandings, which you can get access to on the Teaching of Our Elders website. So the top 7, number 1, sacred relatives, 2, learning and storytelling, 3, sharing and generosity, 4, sense of humor. I always find sense of humor like really funny because it's like we have to have a standard on that to understand that Indigenous peoples have humor and are funny. I actually took an entire class on it in college, which I felt like was cheating, but it was so much fun. 5, tribal policies, treaties, and sovereignty. 6, native contributions. And this really gets to, ties back with that video that I was talking about in how are Indigenous peoples being active and contributing members of our society, and how are we highlighting that with a contemporary lens. And then 7 is native identity. Now, something really cool that they've been working on since 2015 is elder interviews. So they've gone out to different communities and interviewed our Indigenous elders. And you can access them. I think it's really cool by tribal affiliation. Of course, I'm a little biased. I go and watch the MHA Nations the majority of the time, but you can see where each of these, maybe not so well. You can see on here the elder interviews that are linked to YouTube, but they also have them, split up by their tribal affiliations. Just a really good resource for you to utilize, with your students. And then we also have LinkedIn lesson plans with that as well for teachers to utilize, and just different resources on this website. Again, I'll give Leslie this access to this presentation so that you can all have access to it. So right now, Bismarck Public Schools' Indigenous Education Department is technically called Indian Education. And I always say it with quotation marks because the reason why Indigenous peoples in North America are referred to as Indians is because Christopher Columbus thought he landed in India. And so that really also takes away from the idea of Indigenous peoples having sovereignty and using our traditional words and languages. So if you ever need resources or you want to contact us, it's just bismarckschools.org/Indian Education. And we are currently remodeling, but on here you'll be able to access our Title VI and JOM forms. But when students enroll in the district, they have the opportunity to fill those forms out right away. And we find that that's what normally happens. Do you think our social workers know to do that? Our social workers?
Our case workers?
I would say yes. But that's a great question and something that I'll circle back and loop them in on. Typically, the entire process for registering with Bismarck Public Schools is online. And so right when you fill out those different questions, it's pre-populated for them to submit that information as well. And if they don't necessarily fill in their Title VI or JOM paperwork, that's when we send our cultural response coordinators out to connect with the families and then get that paperwork in, because it does impact our funding.
So I don't what any of us heard of that?
Which doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it also means you can't push an advocate to make sure it happens.
Yeah, and this is, a great connection, coming and talking about all the resources available.
When I've enrolled my kids, it does ask me that, like if they're affiliated with the tribes, I put yes, and then it actually gives you more questions if you click yes, so they gotta fill that out. My problem was I didn't always have all the information, like I didn't know like what percentage they were for sure, so I did get some of the information from our caseworker, but yes, I was familiar with that just from enrolling them in school.
You had to enroll your own kids that came into your care?
Did somebody else do it?
So did I.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I was like,
You're free and
Yeah.
and that's where I met Michaela Howling-Wolf, was because she did the Monarch program, and they helped assist with like driver's education and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But that's why I do teenagers, because they know a lot of the information. Although I just handed off the baby, but. You know they're on.
Another resource that I wanted to highlight is our Boys with Braids initiative that we have. So we've seen this pervasive issue of lack of understanding of why Indigenous boys specifically have a braid. And we've seen it with our staff and with peers and with community members. So we partnered with Agency Mabu, which is a Native-owned advertising agency, and the National Indian Education Association. And we created this resource, this video. I'm going to play it, even though the audio is a little spotty, but it's just really important. And again, you'll have access to it afterwards.
For us as Indian people, we are in touch with our surroundings, the land, the animals, our relatives, people who have passed on, the Creator. We bring all this together. The significance of the hair was very strong. You have a son who's Native American, and it's important for him to understand that. And one of the biggest components is your hair.
Growing up, it was always a big thing. My dad always telling me to keep my hair long. It gives me strength, it gives me my power. It's kind of like who I am. And I remember being at a young age, I always kind of wanted to cut it. I never really liked it. I know middle school was a little rough. Trey was like my first friend. A lot of kids would make fun of us for being Native. I did get teased a lot for having long hair. I'd be in the locker room and they'd be like, who let the girl in the locker room? And I would just get called little names like here and there.
And we get called like the prairies and like go back to the res and just try like made fun of like me and George, and especially George for having a braid. We try to help each other out and stick together.
You try to help those situations. You try to talk to your teachers ahead of time and say, this is why George has long hair. This is our importance. This is the problems that we've had in the past. And you try to educate along the way so teachers can head off these problems ahead of time so George doesn't have to go through it. And you know, I've never gone into a place where a teacher has pushed back. They've always been very receptive. They've always been very open, and they've loved George's hair. And when kids understand where George comes from, they loved his hair. I've never had a bad situation where anybody has been like giving George a hard time when they really understood the meaning behind the hair.
I know that the braid and the long hair is something that is important in their culture and something that they're very prideful about. And I've actually used it just lighthearted sometimes because he tucks it into his jersey. So I tell George he should use it as a weapon sometimes. It can kind of create space for him. But you know, honestly, just lighthearted conversations about it. And I think it's super cool that he represents his culture and where he comes from. I love that he's kept it. I love that it's become part of who George is.
I recall a day when we had a conversation about George's hair and other Indigenous students' hair in my classroom. And it's just fun for us to all to learn about each other's different values.
It's just important to have open conversation. I think when race or when background and culture is ever a topic of conversation, people can get uncomfortable. And I don't understand why. Because a lot of people are just blind to the fact that there are differences in our backgrounds and people are raised differently. I feel like I've learned a lot from my colleagues as well about what are some good questions to ask, what are some good ways to start conversations, because for some people it can be uncomfortable, especially if you have not had experience doing it. I think it can be eye-opening for some people, but once you start having those conversations, I don't think it's anything to be uncomfortable about. I think it's something to celebrate.
A friend of mine who is an Indigenous educator told me, just take a day to ask the students about their families and their cultures. It doesn't matter who you are. You have family and you have culture, and everyone can share that.
A lot of the teachers learned from me. They would always ask me questions about what my background is.
As a non-Native teacher, I really do look for Indigenous voices to help me. There are also so many resources all over the internet. We as teachers have the opportunity to address our curriculum from many different angles, and one posture we can take is that of a learner. We don't have to be experts. We can still be learners. It doesn't have to be perfect. If you make a mistake, it's okay. But if you build that culture in your classroom where it's okay to make mistakes, I think your students will give you grace.
I know you can't teach everything perfectly. It's okay to make mistakes because you are going to learn things the more and more you teach something. Even if you do teach it wrong, it's the fact that you're trying to teach it.
Our data says that we need to support our Indigenous students more. We can't ignore it. So I think we as a school, we as a state, really need to address this and make sure that all students have equal opportunity and that all students will be able to access their skills and talents and enter the world fully ready. And I do think that we as a state need to think about how can we close the gap that we are seeing in the data.
It's real important for our kids to understand and know the traumatic effects that historical trauma has passed from generation to generation. It's important for George's friends to learn the process of how we've come to be, how our world has evolved. And that is a huge process in our Native American people. Like, how can you not talk about those things?
Last year, in a journal prompt, I had an Indigenous student say that he felt he had to act white at school. And that was a moment where, as a teacher, I just really needed to search myself and wonder, what can we do to be better teachers for all of our students? I don't want my students to ever filter who they are. I want them to be fully their identities and to understand their identities and to be proud of their identities.
It's not easy to have long hair, especially as a child. For us, it's this connection. His hair is everything. When you see him with a group of kids, you know George is a Native American boy. You know what comes with that. And that means a lot for me as a parent. That's makes me proud.
I feel like my hair does give me a lot of power and a lot of strength. I don't see me cutting my hair anytime soon. It's not something to be ashamed about. It's something that you should be proud of. It's who I am.
Do we have anybody who would like to share? Go ahead.
Like what in our school, in our elementary school, we had a lady that was from Newtown. At the elementary school I work at, we had a lady that was from Newtown and her last name was Bearstail. I could not tell you her first name. Wrote a book. Is it Joelle? Okay, wrote a book. It was about her son. Her son's grade, and we brought in 3rd through 5th for her to read the book to and explain it. And it was about how he was just relentlessly teased about his grade. And then he came on and danced for us in his uniform. And that was probably a really very large learning experience for 3 grades, for a whole school to just understand just that one book. So it was very impactful when they did that, when they brought that in, and she read that book, and then she brought him home, and then he did a dance for us that everybody just loved. And I believe his father and uncle were playing the drums. Yep. And it was great. It was phenomenal.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Joelle Bearsell wrote a book about her son's experience actually within Bismarck Public Schools. And we invite her in very frequently to talk about her experience as a parent. And then, you had the opportunity to hear from her son, and the father and uncle were there as well. So thank you for sharing that. Any other reflections? Go ahead.
I was just thinking that, North Dakota is not known for being very diverse. I grew up here. Like, if you look at our information, like, we're not a diverse state. We're just not. So if you think of somebody like, if you were going to school in New York or something like that, like if you were sending your kids to school in New York City, they might be going to school with Hasidic Jews and girls that always wore their hair covered, that kind of thing. And they would all just you would get used to things that are a little different. But around here, we just don't have a lot of that. So it probably does stick out more. So I think that's really good when they're actually explaining things and making it more like there is a reason for this, and this is why. So I think that's really good.
Thank you for sharing. Any other reflections?
I have a, is this a dumb question to ask? Okay. So when I'm working with a bio parent, is it appropriate to even ask, like, is this something that's important to you? Like, how to ask those questions to really understand, like, how into their culture are they? What aspects are important for me to know and understand? I know we don't always have that opportunity early on, but I mean, I guess I'm always struggling for the right way to ask.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things.
And I would say, you know, for Indigenous peoples or for just other cultures, I think that once you have, you know, started that conversation, just asking, are there any significant cultural practices that I should be aware of? And just, you know, entering that conversation with respect. I mean, that's as simple as it can be, you know? But we get that question a lot, but it's really engaging in the conversation and knowing to even ask that question, I think is probably one of the biggest pieces. All right, I'm gonna keep going here. And so I took a presentation that I typically do with our staff and I just modified it to cover a little bit more about our programming. But some of the additional information that I have on here, like this coming March 22nd, we will be having a spring equinox celebration. So in the past, we would traditionally have like a Christmas party. But when you look at the intentionality behind the Johnson O'Malley grant and Title VI, it is supposed to utilize that funding to retain and revitalize Indigenous cultures and languages and support students' academic progress. And so even though like I celebrate Christmas, a lot of our families don't have the opportunity to celebrate the spring equinox. So we provide that opportunity. Now we aren't having it on the actual spring equinox, which is March 20th, also my birthday. But we did want to provide an opportunity to share some cultural information, and then we're going to play bingo, and then we're going to do a round dance. And we partnered with United Tribes, Theodore Jameson, Mandan Public Schools, in addition to the Monarch Project, and that's going to be next March 22nd, next Wednesday, I believe.
Is that free?
Yep, it's free. It's free. We'll have prizes. Well, everybody's welcome. So come out. It's gonna be at the United Tribes gym. So yeah, so definitely come out, bring the kids. There's gonna be lots of kids activities. Dr. Dakota Goodhouse is gonna be doing our cultural presentation and information. There's a free meal. It should be a pretty big deal. We're really excited. So something else that we do for our Indigenous seniors is we have a feather tying ceremony for our seniors, and we work with the families to make sure that every student does have an eagle feather plume, and then we have different meetings leading up to that feather tying ceremony where our students will learn from elders on, you know, their responsibility to carry that feather and what that means to their community. And we do that so that our students have an opportunity, but we never want to conflict with a student's personal tribal information. So if they have access to that, we always encourage that. We just want to give them that opportunity to celebrate and to actually have, you know, their loved one tie their feather on and be recognized for their graduation, which is a milestone. We've also produced a cultural handbook, which Rusty Gillette, you saw the father in the video, he illustrated the book for us. And so we use this in classrooms. You can connect with your students. It's available on our website. You can print it out and just go through that book with students. I pulled it up so you can get a glimpse of it here. You know when you have just like too many tabs open and then everybody gets to see that? Here we go. So this is just kind of a brief overview of our booklet. We talk about, you know, how do you say hello in your traditional language? So like in Haratsa and Nuita, we say dosha. Family ties, sense of belonging, branching out into others' cultures, cultivating that global awareness, foods and recipes. It's just a really good opportunity to have students investigate further into their culture. that's awesome.
What ages do you usually do this book with? Oops. Is there a certain age group you usually do the handbook with?
We actually use like K-12.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's pretty manageable. You know, for the older kids, they can we can ask them additional questions and make their writing a little bit more reflective and challenge them a little bit more. But it's also manageable enough for the younger kids.
How do we get one of those?
It's accessible on our website. Bismarck Public
Did you
Schools.
say this is something you guys kind of go through with?
Yep, we utilize this with our students, but it's definitely something that you can utilize with your students as well.
So I think like we all have these kids in school, but like nobody's heard of it.
Yeah.
Well, that's okay. And I just want to preface, this is why Sassy is here though. Like,
Yeah.
So if you're accessing a tool with them, like how are our kids not getting it or we not aware of it? Where's the yeah, absolutely. So I will say that our program is not new, but the development of it is relatively new. So when I was in school, our program was really known for handing out backpacks in the fall, hosting maybe a cultural event throughout the year, and then celebrating a Christmas party. And so the connection that I've had with my schooling and coming back to the community has been making sure that Indigenous education, the mindset shift is happening within our educators where it's not an add-on. It is something that is embedded within our tier 1 interventions. So I do a lot of professional developments with our schools. I'm able to do onboarding with new teachers. And so all these concepts are relatively new within the past year. And so we only have 3 cultural responsive coordinators that service 28 buildings. So us building capacity, that's kind of where we're at. And a lot of our training has been started with what are appropriate terms to utilize? And then we can dig in. So getting everybody with that baseline information so then they can also dig in. So building that capacity, building people's awareness of the resources. It's slow, but it's coming. And so if we have a cultural responsive coordinator that is working with a student who would be a tier 3, which means they need heavy interventions, maybe academically or behavior, that's kind of where our cultural responsive coordinators come in. Now the tier 1, that would be everybody's gonna get this. And that's what we're working on towards. But yeah, that's a great question. And as we continue as a department, sharing additional information, making sure that we're communicating with families across the board is one of our priorities. We have also gifted all 28 of our campuses tribal flags. So the tribal nations that share North Dakota's borders, they should be represented at every campus within Bismarck Public Schools. And like I mentioned, there's 28 of them. We have 16 elementary schools. And with that, we've been doing tribal flag observations. So we don't call it a ceremony because of the connotations and meanings of ceremony within our different cultures. So we just call them an observation. So we go through each of the tribal nations and what their tribal flag represents and what that means. And we have, out of the 5, we have 4 represented. And sometimes we'll bring in a 5th person just to round out that experience and share on their culture and their tribal nation. And then I just have some of the pieces that I go into with our educators, just so you're aware of. We do have 574 federally recognized tribes, the difference between reservation and urban areas and how that impacts Indigenous students' identities and what we're trying to do to foster a healthy contemporary Indigenous identity. What federally recognized tribes mean, and I kind of went over that a little bit earlier. The importance of culturally relevant practices and how that makes our students, empowers our students to be more successful and engage in their classroom. Building relational capacity, empowering student voice, always holding high expectations, respecting experiences, and then those are our additional resources. Have you all heard of smudging?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I put some of this at the end so that.
But explain.
Yeah.
I've heard of it, but explain
Yes.
it and what the significance.
Yeah, so something that we do and that we've been incorporating with our students is giving them the opportunity to smudge. And so that is like cleansing spiritually, physically, mentally, like all the components. Cleansing yourself off. You know, when we smudge, we burn typically sage, but you can use some of our other medicines. We use a shell, and when you burn the sage, you take the smoke and you smudge yourself off. And I just call it like you clean yourself off, like mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And that's something that we've been providing like our students with the opportunity to do. We did have a student pass away at Legacy this year, and what we did with our circle groups is we brought them together, assisted them with processing their grief, connecting them to mental health experts, but then also we brought them out and were able to smudge with them. Which in hearing from the students, they said it was just very healing. They were really just grateful that they had the opportunity to do that at school when they are legally required to be there, but then have the opportunity to partake in some cultural practices. So that being said, I dropped a lot of information on you. I appreciate the questions. If there are additional questions, yeah.
Let's pass the mic to questions.
Yes, can I help with that?
So going back, for kids to be a part of this program, they have to be registered.
So yes and no. So
This is my workout.
thank you. Perfect. Perfect. I'm finally getting feeling back in my legs.
I
So.
meant to say enroll.
I meant the word enroll.
Yeah, so it's yes and no for they don't have to be enrolled in their tribal nations. They're eligible, they will fall under Title VI. They do have to be a quarter blood quantum as of right now for the Johnson O'Malley, but I was literally in DC last week lobbying with legislators to change some of those practices. Like I had mentioned, the blood quantum thing just doesn't really sit well with like how we.
Well, the follow-up for that is that George and I have adopted two out of Austria, and they're not related, but they're half white and they are half Native, and one is Sioux, and the other one is Navajo and Sioux. But for them to register, is they registered out of order with the Navajo Nation. The bio mom was not registered with Navajo, she was registered with Sioux, so she could have.
Yep, you can only be enrolled in one tribe. Thank
But
you.
then she does not have enough quantum blood for the Sioux tribe.
And it's gonna depend on each tribe as well.
Right, and then the other one is a very complicated case, and her mom never registered herself, so they are not registered. So when it came time for adopting, then it didn't apply because we sent affidavits back to the tribes, and they said no, that it will not apply for them. But that doesn't make them any less indigenous.
Absolutely.
And that's I think where I struggle is, it's like, because I would love for them to know everything they can about everything that they can about themselves, but I don't even know I know how to start. It's just where to start to explain to them, like, this is your tribe, but you're not enough to be registered to them, but this is your tribe. And now the third one that we're going through another process with is ICWA. And it's looking like everything's going to, because we've had her for 21 months. And she is registered, she is enrolled with MHA. And just seeing all the benefits that she is going to get from the MHA, and that the other two just don't get that. It's kind of sad to me because of the equation that someone's put out. Correct? Is that?
Yep.
Correct to
And
say?
like I had mentioned before, the blood quantum was actually like the construction from the federal government to breed out indigenous peoples.
Right. So now, like, I'm wondering, how can they be, they're both students at BPS, how can I get them to be with your program?
Yeah, yeah.
So that they can start learning that now.
Yeah, so two things, I'm so cute. First of all, like if you self-identify as an indigenous person, you receive our services. Our funding is tied to those federal documents that we have to take and report, but we also supplement some of our funding with district funding, and then we find like donations and stuff. So like if you self-identify as an Indigenous student, you will receive our funding. But then going back to the tier 1, like a lot of this information should be accessible for all students, whether you're Indigenous or not, because it should be the tier 1 in your classroom, available like throughout your building and all those different components that we are steadily working towards. You know, like a lot of the training that we've done. So just because your students aren't enrolled or maybe don't have a quarter, then they still receive our programming, and we will find the funding if they, you know, need things to be covered within their class fees and whatnot.
And in my own personal case, we don't need like the funding for that. It's just, I want them to know, I want them to be with people that are from their tribe or that know their ancestors that can do that, because if I do it, it's gonna be reading from a book or learning from what I can learn, and I feel that that's kind of cheap for them to know.
You know, I wouldn't describe that experience as cheap, because they know that you've taken the time to invest in learning about their culture and their people. So I would never devalue, you know, your experience. It is definitely something that is important to connect them with people from their tribe for them to have the opportunity to learn. And that's something that, you know, as we're building out this program and bringing in a multitude and a varied and diverse perspectives for tribal nations, just because even the MHA Nation, we have the Mananadats or Rippara, which is typically what you hear them as. Those are 3 separate tribes with 3 different languages. And the only reason why they came together was because of the smallpox epidemic, wiping out 80% of the Mandans the first smallpox epidemic. But when we bring in these opportunities, we want to make sure, because of Title VI and because of JOM, because of our treaties, like we have a legal responsibility to our students to provide them the opportunity to engage in their cultural tribal legacies, their languages, and all those, you know, different opportunities to retain or revitalize Indigenous cultures. So where I would recommend starting is having conversations like with your teachers and asking them what they're doing to further their learning or to engage with like our department or community members. Each of our cultural responsive coordinators are accessible for everyone here. Just a reminder, Donovan is the south side, so that's VHS, Wachter, and then the corresponding elementaries. Jason Davis is the Northeast Cultural Responsive Coordinator, that's Legacy, Sinley, and then Chadwick is Century and Horizon. And then if you have students in high school, they also have the added layer of the Monarch Project, which I would definitely recommend enrolling your students in.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe a little unrelated, but what is your thoughts on how kids instead of one form should be enrolled, or people enrolled in tribal nations?
Okay, so like my perspective on blood quantum and enrolling in tribes. So it's hard because I speak from like my perspective, and I can only speak from that. I can't speak for my tribe. I can't speak for urban Indians. Like I'm just representing my voice. And from what I've learned was that, you know, Indigenous peoples went through a genocide, and the blood quantum was an external way. The only things that are tracked by blood are horses, dogs, and Native Americans. And so when we think about how almost degrading that is in our identity, we have some of the older generation, some of our elders will talk about how, you know, they're very proud to be a quarter or to be half. And in their time, like that was a safe way to be an Indigenous person, and it was something to hold on to and be proud of. And I would never take that experience away from them. But as we learn and we grow and we become more educated, we now understand like why that was put in place. And so I think it's inappropriate for us to use it as tribal nations to recognize our own people. And we have, like, if you look at, let's say that like the Navajo Nation, like the Nene is how you say their name. So they, like when they have their like tribal princesses, that you have to speak and you have to partake in like cultural activities. Like those are their methods of, you know, making sure that you're connected to your tribe. So that's my opinion. Making sure that we're getting back to like our cultural identity and retaining, revitalizing our ways, our languages. Like those are what we should be focusing on. But it's not black or white. There's plenty of shades of gray, and a lot of it has to do, it's tied to our sovereignty. So it's just a really, really complicated issue, and I don't want to undersell it, but it's definitely something to look into and read on. Any other questions?
I'm gonna ask all the questions.
Yeah.
I don't know how to ask, okay? Yeah. Because I'm learning right now with a bio mom. But so she said something to me recently, and I haven't had time to unpack what it really means, but maybe you can shed some light, because the video maybe alluded to it, where I tried to add light, right? And so mom said to me, I'm trying to understand how far to take these white man ways in what we're doing right now, like really trying, and I'm like, I don't even know what that means when she says that. Can you help me understand a little bit more about what that means, and maybe how I should be maybe understanding what it looks like when I'm working with a parent, right?
Yeah. I would say I can't really help you unpack that statement.
I mean, I'm unpacking with her. Give me a baseline to go in.
Baseline, I would say a lot of the work that I've been engaging in within Bismarck Public Schools is, you know, just that lack of understanding that our staff have of the lived Indigenous experience. And part of that is really understanding the historical narrative of what's happened to Indigenous peoples, and knowing that there were federal policies enacted against Indigenous peoples, whether it was to put them on reservations, whether it was to remove them from reservations and throw them into cities. We have these different eras of Indian policy, and to really fully understand that and dig into that and know that, I think is really important when you're engaging with Indigenous peoples. It goes back to like the land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements have been scrutinized because there are oftentimes used as performative by different universities or school districts or organizations. What I tell our staff within BPS is that we pair our land acknowledgement with building awareness and challenging people to incorporate culturally relevant practices. So it's paired with action. And so I think the foundation is learning about Indigenous people's histories and how we are here today. But also it's changing that deficit narrative. So when we think about Indigenous peoples and what we've learned from them, whether it's from Hollywood or from our K through 12 education, which is, in my experience, been significantly lacking in an accurate depiction, it's really healing to have that opportunity to learn. So I would say that's foundation-wise, and then there are different avenues that you can take to learn more in depth about different Indigenous cultures. But even then, there are some pieces of our ceremony and some pieces of our culture that shouldn't be accessible to people who are not in that tribe. And so really understanding and learning that, because when we look even back with anthropologists, they came into our communities and took information that really didn't belong to them. And now it's public and pieces like that. So understanding the delicate relationship and knowing that you have to be an authentic partner with Indigenous peoples as we engage in this. Even if we look at alcoholism within Indigenous communities, if you look at the very first introduction of alcohol into Indigenous communities, the very first documentation that we have is it was used as social lubricant to take advantage of trade opportunities. And then you can literally look at this historical narrative of alcohol being used as a tool of manipulation with Indigenous communities, whether it was on reservations, being used as medicine, all these, this historical narrative of just alcohol and what it's done to our communities. And then you look at the biological effects that alcohol has. And then you can see, okay, this is why we're here. This is why it's an epidemic in Indian country right now. What are we doing to empower and to learn and to break some of those insidious cycles? I would say that's where we start. Okay. Sorry, that was a lot.
Can I ask Leslie, do you think that your bio mom meant how to navigate through the legal and like the foster care stuff? Is that what she was talking about?
I think it was in relation to parenting in some way. I don't know, we have a good relationship, so I know we'll get to talk about it when it makes sense to talk about it. It was just like a permission for her to say whatever she needed to say moment, like, you're not gonna offend me, say whatever you need to say right now. And then I thought, I don't know what that means. So, and it wasn't the right moment for me to say, you're gonna have to help me understand what that really means in us co-parenting, because that's what we've been talking about, is we're co-parenting right now. So how do we do that together?
How about younger kids that aren't in school yet? Anything to start introducing to them, you know, toddlerish age or something?
Yeah. As far as pre-K education, I would just, provide them just opportunities to hear their language. We know that, like phonetically, if you don't hear certain sounds, you're not able to actually reproduce them later. So providing them the opportunity to just hear their language, which you can access depending on the tribe. Sometimes it's on their website. I know the MHA has different websites specifically for their language. I think that's a really good opportunity. But also just like representation, making sure that the literature that we use, even pre-K, has representation for that. I think is really important. Those are two that I would highlight.
I'd like to say, how long was it to like find it on YouTube? I have a 1-year-old granddaughter that I started playing for her, so she so she knows the culture and the dancing, because I want her to start dancing. She's 1.5 years, so you can find them on YouTube.
And then, like for BPS, we're also offering dance classes. Partnering with United Tribes. How young? I would say, yeah, but it's really open to the community. We just don't advertise to the community. And I'm always available, email, reach out to your cultural responsive coordinators, have questions, think of things later. If you want me to do another session, I know that lots of information. Go ahead.
So all the kids we've had in our home, like I've been close to my daughter's age. And so how do you teach them both, but like appropriately?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I would say like engaging in the conversation is how you just start. Because when you're providing them those experiences and those opportunities, it's good for students who are non-native, it's good for our native students. It's going to provide, we call it windows, mirrors, and doors, sliding glass doors. So with the window, students are able to see, or what's your daughter's age? She's almost 3, yeah. They're able to see into another culture, into another person's lived experience, or in this case, like an indigenous nation or tribal histories. Like those pieces you're able to look in through the window, but then for your foster care students, they're able to see themselves reflected in the mirror, and then that provides opportunities to open doors. Does that answer your question?
Okay, we better wrap up.
Yeah. Well, Mazagadas for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to just come out and share with you all and get the word out on our departments and our programming.
Yeah,
All right, we'll get resources posted. I'm super excited about all the stuff that you shared in there and checking out the links. I think there's a lot of really good resources that just incorporate into what we're doing at our house when we have kiddos come in that this applies to. So with that, if you need to pay any membership dues tonight, Adam's your guy over here. He'll take your money, $20 for your family for the whole year. Your children, take them with you, as always. And appreciate the babysitters that kept everything. And Nina, who did art with your kids tonight. So, all right, is there any other announcements I've forgotten? I'm looking.
Oh, I have one announcement.
Okay, one announcement.
Little Lights Pediatric Therapy, they worked with a gal to do a clothing drive, and they still have a lot of clothing. So if you get a placement that doesn't have clothing, or you're helping transition a placement that doesn't have a lot of clothing, they have all ages clothing available. So you can either reach out to the association and we will get you a suitcase with the size clothing you need, or you can reach out directly to Little Lights Pediatric Therapy and ask them about a suitcase of clothing.
All right, we'll see you guys all next month. Thanks for being here.